Chapter 7 of Army Life in a Black Regiment. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. Army Life in a Black Regiment by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Chapter 7. Up the Edisto. In reading military history, one finds the main interest to lie undoubtedly in the great campaigns where a man, a regiment, a brigade is but a pawn in the game. But there is a charm also in the more free and adventurous life of partisan warfare, where, if the total sphere be humbler, yet the individual has more relative importance, and the scene of action is more personal and keen. This is the reason given by the eccentric revolutionary biographer Weems for writing the life of Washington first, and then that of Marion. And there were, certainly, high in the early adventures of the colored troops of the Department of the South, some of the same elements of picturesqueness that belonged to Marion's band on the same soil, with the added feature that the blacks were fighting for their personal liberties, of which Marion had helped to deprive them. It is stated by Major General Gillmore, in his Siege of Charleston, as one of the 3 points of his preliminary strategy, that an expedition was sent up by the Edisto River to destroy a bridge on the Charleston and Savannah Railway. As one of the early raids of the colored troops, this expedition may deserve narration, though it was, in a strategic point of view, a disappointment. It has already been told, briefly and on the whole with truth, by Greenlee and others, but I will venture on a more complete account. The project dated back earlier than General Gillmore's siege, and had originally no connection with that movement. It had been formed by Captain Trowbridge and myself in camp, and was based on the facts learned from the men. General Saxton and Colonel W. W. H. Davis, the successive post commanders, had both favored it. It had been also approved by General Hunter before his sudden removal, though he regarded the bridge as secondary affair, because there was another railway communication between the two cities. But, as the main object was to obtain permission to go, I tried to make the most of all results which might follow. While it was very clear that the raid would harass and confuse the enemy, and be the means of bringing away many of the slaves, General Hunter had therefore accepted the project mainly as a stroke for freedom and black recruits, and General Gillmore because anything that looked towards action found favor in his eyes, and because it would be convenient to him at that time to effect a diversion, if nothing more. It must be remembered that, after the first capture of Port Royal, the outlying plantations along the whole southern coast were abandoned, and the slaves withdrawn into the interior. It was necessary to ascend some river for 30 miles in order to reach the black population at all. This ascent could only be made by night, and it was a slow process, and the smoke of a steamboat could be seen for a great distance. The streams were usually shallow, winding, and muddy, and the difficulties of navigation were such as to require a full moon and a flooded tide. It was really no easy matter to bring everything to bear, especially as every projected raid must be kept a secret so far as possible. However, we were now somewhat familiar with such undertakings, half military, half naval, and the thing to be done on the Edisto was precisely what had been proved to be practicable on the St. Mary's and the St. John's, to drop anchor before the enemy's door some morning at daybreak without his having dreamed of our approach. Since a raid made by Colonel Montgomery up the Combahee 2 months before, the vigilance of the rebels had increased. But we had information that upon the South Edisto, or Pompon River, the rice plantations were still being actively worked by a large number of negroes, in reliance on obstructions placed at the mouth of that narrow stream where it joins the main river, some 20 miles from the coast. This point was known to be further protected by a battery of unknown strength at Wiltown Bluff, a commanding and defensible position. The obstructions consisted of a row of strong wooden piles across the river, but we convinced ourselves that these must now be much decayed, and that Captain Trowbridge, an excellent engineer officer, could remove them by the proper apparatus. Our proposition was to man the John Adams, an armed ferry-boat which had before done us much service, and which had now reverted to the pursuits of peace, it is said, on the East Boston line, to ascend in this to Wiltown Bluff, silence the battery, and clear the passage through the obstructions. Leaving the John Adams to protect this point, we could then ascend the smaller stream with 2 light draught boats and perhaps burn the bridge, which was 10 miles higher, before the enemy could bring sufficient force to make our position at Wilton Bluff untenable. The expedition was organized essentially upon this plan. The smaller boats were the Enoch Dean, a river steamboat which carried a 10-pound Parrott gun and a small howitzer, and a little mosquito of a tug, the Governor Milton, upon which, with the greatest difficulty, we found room for two 12-pound Armstrong guns, with their gunners, forming a section of the 1st Connecticut Battery under Lieutenant Clinton, aided by a squad from my own regiment under Captain James. The John Adams carried, if I remember rightly, 2 Parrott guns of 20 and 10 pounds calibre, and a howitzer or two. The whole force of men did not exceed 250. We left Beaufort, SC, on the afternoon of July 9th, 1863. In former narrations I have sufficiently described the charm of a moonlight ascent into a hostile country, upon an unknown stream, the dark and silent banks, the rippling water, the wail of the reed birds, the anxious watch, the breathless listening, the veiled lights, the whispered orders. To this was now to be added the vexation of insufficient pilotage, for our negro guide knew only of the upper river, and, as it finally proved, not even that, while to take us over the bar which obstructed the main stream we must borrow a pilot from Captain Dutch, whose gunboat blockaded that point. This active naval officer, however, whose boat expeditions had penetrated all the lower branches of those streams, could not supply our want, and we borrowed from him not only a pilot but a surgeon to replace our own, who had been prevented by an accident from coming with us. Thus accompanied, we steamed over the bar in safety, and had a peaceful ascent, passed the island of Jehozy, the fine estate of Governor Aiken, then left undisturbed by both sides, and fired our first shell into the camp at Wilton Bluff at 4 o'clock in the morning. The battery, whether fixed or movable we knew not, met us with a promptness that proved very short-lived. After 3 shots it was silent, but we could not tell why. The bluff was wooded, and we could see but little. The only course was to land under cover of the guns. As the firing ceased and the smoke cleared away, I looked across the rice-fields which lay beneath the bluff. The first sunbeams glowed upon their emerald leaves and on the blossoming hedges along the rectangular dikes. What were those black dots which everywhere appeared? Those moist meadows had become alive with human heads, and along each narrow path came a straggling file of men and women, all on a run for the river. I went ashore with a boat-load of troops at once. The landing was difficult and marshy. The astonished negroes tugged us up the bank and gazed at us as if we had been Cortez or Columbus. They kept arriving by land much faster than we could come by water, every moment increased the crowd, the jostling, the mutual clinging, on that miry foothold. What a scene it was! With the wild faces, eager figures, strange garments, it seemed as if one of the poor things reverently suggested, like nothing but de Judgment Day. Presently they began to come from the houses also, with their little bundles on their heads, then with larger bundles. Old women trotting on the narrow paths would kneel to pray a little prayer, still balancing the bundle, and then would suddenly spring up, urged by the accumulation of procession from behind, and would move on till irresistibly compelled by the thankfulness to dip down for another invocation. Reaching us, every human being must grasp our hands, and amid exclamations of "Bress you, massa," and "Bress de Lord," at the rate of 4 of the latter ascriptions to one of the former. Women brought children on their shoulders. Small black boys leaned on their black little brothers, easily inky, and gravely depositing them, shook hands. Never had I seen human beings so clad, or rather so unclad, in such amazing squalidness and destitution of garments. I recall one small urchin without a rag of clothing save the basque waist of a lady's dress, bristling with whalebones, and worn wrong side before, beneath which his smooth ebony legs emerged like those of an ostrich from its plumage. How weak is imagination, how cold is memory, that I ever cease for a day in my life to see before me the picture of that astounding scene. Yet at the time we were perforce a little impatient of all this piety, protestation, and hand-pressing, for the vital thing was to ascertain what force had been stationed at the bluff, and whether it was yet withdrawn. The slaves on